Well, hello everybody. How are you all today? Good? I was intrigued by the theme of this series, the seminars, locally engaged, globally connected. And I thought that could be a strapline for my organization, the British Foreign Service. Our job is to be very locally engaged in order to deliver globally for our organization. And in thinking about that, I thought, what can I talk to you about? Something of myself and perhaps the way I go about my business. So I decided on the theme, which I will expand on, the power of the personal. You can tell me at the end of this whether or not I've covered it. But in a globalized, interconnected world, where everything is happening in real time, we're on our social media, whatever that is, Facebook, Twitter, and all the rest of it, and the new stuff coming through. But what really drives success in this world is the personal connection that each of you makes. Whatever profession, career, whatever lies out there in the future for you, if you think about it in terms of your own family, your close network of friends, if you're not personally connected, those relationships don't work. For diplomats like me, it's bread and butter. You know, when you can find out about what's going on in the world the instant it happens, what is the value add to pay for someone like me to be here in New Zealand? When you can read about what's happening in New Zealand the instant it's happening. So the difference that we have to make in a modern reality is the insights, the relationships that we can build that you simply cannot do at a distance. If you think back for any foreign service, but of course the British Foreign Service is one that is very old and goes back centuries. And back in the day, you know, you could have been the commissioner in India, and it would take about 3 months for your latest dispatch to get back to London. There was no other way to know what was happening in India, except perhaps the odd traveller coming back to the UK. But in this century, in the world that we live in, the difference that we make is about the personal relationships that drive our knowledge, gives us the insights that make a difference. And I want to give you a couple of examples where by developing relationships that are driven by personal connections, you can make a huge difference. And I'll give you this example. How many of you have heard about the Shackletons whisky that was discovered under Shackleton's hut? And then they reproduced it. So let me tell you the story, and I will go back about 5 years. My last job was in Mumbai, heading our Western India operation as the Deputy High Commissioner based in Mumbai. I had about 200 staff, and I had offices in Ahmedabad, Pune, Mumbai itself, and down in Goa. And a large element of my job was about promoting Britain as a trade partner, as a destination for Indian investment. And I got a phone call one day from a gentleman called Dr. Vijay Mallya, industrialist, entrepreneur, billionaire. And the reason why he wanted to see me was that he was going to buy a little Scottish whisky company, White & Mackay. And he was very worried because he'd just tried to buy a French champagne brand, and the French weren't very keen for an Indian to own it. This might strike a chord here in New Zealand. But so he had this war chest of money that he wasn't able to spend, and he thought, if I can't buy champagne, what's the next best thing? The Scots might disagree with this, fine malt whisky. And he wanted to chat with me as British Deputy High Commissioner because he was a bit worried that there might be an adverse reaction from the British government. But Britain has been very open to foreign direct investment. China is our second largest investor in Britain after the US, by the way. So I went along to see Vijay, and I explained to him that we had no such difficulty as long as he was going to develop the brands, he was going to invest, he'd look after the workforce, he'd continue to help promote Scottish whisky worldwide. And he said, of course, that's why I'm buying it. And anyway, I can't strip out the assets because I can't make Scotch whisky, the real stuff, in India, which is a fact. So that's how I got to know Vijay. And of course, he had other millions to invest, and I was keen to build a relationship with him. But here's my secret. Of course, these are professional relationships, but to leverage the most out of them, and that sounds pretty cold, but that's the name of the game, I think you have to build trust, and you have to find out about people. You have to find something that you like about them. You have to find a personal connection. You have to give a bit of yourself. So over the subsequent months, I got to know Vijay very well. He then invested in a Formula One racing team, which used to be called Spiker Racing and is now Force India. It's based in Milton Keynes in the English Midlands, not far from Silverstone. So that was good. And one day I was at his place for dinner, and he said to me, you know, Vicki, have you heard about this whiskey they've discovered under Shackleton's hut? And I said, no, I haven't. And he said, you know, McKinley's is one of my brands. Do you think they'll give me a couple of bottles? And I said, no, Vijay, I don't think they will. I knew enough about heritage that this was not going to be handed over to some Indian billionaire just because he owned the brand. That was the end of it. And about 2 years later, when I knew I was coming to New Zealand, he happened to be at my place for dinner. Meanwhile, we were working with him to get more investments into Britain and to build up his current investments. Good for the British economy, good for keeping our workforce and adding to it. And I said to him, by the way, Vijay, I can now tell you where I'm going to next. I'm going to be British High Commissioner to Wellington. So Vijay says to me, isn't that near Antarctica? And I said, actually, it's a hell of a lot closer than Mumbai is. And he said, you know, if you ever come across the whiskey, you must let me know. I mean, he was deeply fascinated. He thought this was the most romantic story, and he couldn't get over the fact that at that time, explorers to Antarctica took lots of booze with them. And if you think about the ledger, I think it was 3 cases of McKinley's, 2 cases of the finest French brandy, and a case of port. Maybe that's why he didn't quite make it. So coming back to being here in Wellington, one of your great sort of elder statesmen who is the chairman of the Antarctic Heritage Trust came to see me because one of the little extra hats I get with the job is to be a trustee on the Antarctic Heritage Trust board. And he'd come to brief me about my, duties, and as you do, I said to him, so what are the current challenges for the trust at the moment? He said, well, government grants are going down. We're going to have to find new ways to generate revenue streams. We're having to become entrepreneurial. And we've had this idea. And I said, well, what's that idea? We've been trying to interest White and Mackay in Glasgow to perhaps produce a replica of the Shackletons whiskey. And I said, really? And he said, they don't answer our letters, they don't take our calls, our emails bounce back. Maybe we've got the email ID wrong. But as the British High Commissioner, you're bound to know someone senior in Glasgow who can help us out. So I said to him, Paul, I'm really sorry, but I don't. And I saw he thought, well, what's the bloody use of this British High Commissioner? And I said, but I tell you who I do know. I happen to know their Indian owner very well. And if you like, I can give him a call because I know he's deeply fascinated by this story. So Paul said to me, do you think you can do that? And I said, of course. I've got his number here on my mobile phone, and I'll give him a call. I'll give him a couple of hours because he's not an early riser. He's a night bird. So that's what I did. I rang Vijay. Now, let me just pause there. Quite often, we build relationships for a specific geography. They are local relationships for the job we do at that particular point. But I really believe you keep and build your networks as you move around, whether it's within a country or it's across geographies. If you nurture your networks and you maintain them and you care for them, you never know when they're going to come back and really be important. And when you leave, it just needs a little bit of effort, perhaps remembering the birthday, the odd text, your email, or you tweet to each other, just to keep the relationship warm, simmering on the back burner. I do it with all my key relationships. And of course, the older you get and the more people you have in your network, actually the whole work planning thing and how you compress all of that into an average day. But that is the challenge. I'd rather live long and have a bigger and growing problem like that than having a short, sweet, fantastic life. So I rang Vijay. He said, fantastic. And I said, Vijay, what you have to do, you see, if you've got good relationships, you can tell people what to do, is to phone your guys in Glasgow and make the deal. Connect them with the AHT people and work out what proportion of the profits for this replica whiskey that you're going to make will go to them. A couple of weeks later, the deal was done. At the next AHT board, everyone was delighted. We drank a toast to each other. This would be fantastic. And then the problem of how to get the whiskey that had defrosted slowly, was down in Canterbury Museum, how to get the whiskey to Glasgow. You can't really pop it in the post or get DHL to take it, special packaging, has to be escorted, and we hadn't factored in the cost of this. So I said, well, Vijay has a private jet. Shall I ask him to go and pick up the master distiller who technically the whiskey would be released to for scientific research? And it is scientific research. Pick you up in Mumbai and then come to New Zealand, collect the whiskey and get it to Glasgow as quickly as possible. So the board said, do you think you can do that? I said, I can but ask. So I did, and the rest, as they say, is history. Vijay did just that. I remember meeting him in Queenstown, that's another story. And we then went down to Christchurch. We arrived in Christchurch at 3 p.m. We went straight to the museum. The handover ceremony took place. A tour of the Antarctic exhibition there, which he'd never seen. And then we had a slap-up dinner, and I remember going to the airport and waving him and his wonderfully named girlfriend, Pinky, off. So they left at midnight from Christchurch. They landed in Glasgow at lunchtime on the Monday. And the first tiny molecules were extracted on the Tuesday. And of course, there were very strict criteria. The bottles, and they were given 3. One, if you can do it with one, you leave the other 2 intact. But as sort of a second and third try, you don't succeed, that's it. The first few molecules were extracted, and the chemical components were broken down to work out what were the whiskies, what was the blend, even where the peat came from, could they identify the spring waters. That was the research, to work out how to recreate a whiskey that was as close in chemical construction as the original. About 8 months later, the first replica bottles of Shackleton whiskey hit the market, and it made for Antarctic Heritage Trust about $500,000 New Zealand towards the work on the ice. So these kind of relationships not only matter and help me hugely in my job in Mumbai, but helped me make a reasonable impact when I first arrived here in terms of my contribution to the Antarctic Heritage Trust Board. And none of it would have worked if there hadn't been trust. And actually, being confident that you can pull it off. I give another little talk about the 3 C's that I go by, which is about having courage to believe in yourself and to aim for the things that you want to achieve, to then have the conviction to pursue it, and absolute confidence in each step that you take in doing that. Courage, conviction, and confidence. And that's what I did to get that deal on the table for the Antarctic Heritage Trust. But what drove all of it was the very personal relationships that I leveraged for a good cause and for the right outcome. And in a different context, and a sort of more tragic sort of example. When I was in Mumbai in November 2008, some of you may remember the dreadful terrorist attack, 10 young men, a commando-style attack on Mumbai. Well, one of the roles of a diplomat and a senior leader of a mission is that we go into what we call crisis response. And in a moment like that, when you look to your team, I had about 180 staff in Mumbai, one of our larger missions. We all stop the day job and become part of the crisis response team. Now, this was a fraught and dangerous environment, and in the initial hours that the terrorist attack was playing out, we really didn't know what was happening. We were at the eye of the storm, but we knew our job was to be on the front line, to find the British people that might have been caught out by this. So our consular response to look after our people, to find them, to make sure that they are okay. And then the other part of the job, which is to work with the local authorities to see if there is anything that Britain can do to help. But the first job is with your own team, to deploy them into that environment. And if you don't do the day job well, if you don't have the personal understanding of each and every member of your staff, if they do not have the trust and respect in you when you ask them to do something extraordinary, you can't deliver the crisis response that you need to. So again, it comes down to the power of your personal relationships and your interaction with your own team, that when you make the call, they will be there because they will know instinctively that you will have judged the risk and you will not be asking them to do something unless it is absolutely necessary. So to give you an example of that, within minutes of the attacks, and this was a multi-center attack, the railway station, 2 of the 5-star hotels, one of the iconic cafes, Leopold's, down in Colaba in the Victorian heart of Mumbai, and of course the Jewish center. And it felt as though there were more than 10 young men. And estimates of, a commando force of 50, it was wildly exaggerated, but it was just 10 young men who did this. But we knew that the casualties were being taken to 3 main hospitals. And in the rather chaotic environment of Mumbai, unlike the Christchurch earthquake, where there's a very clear chain of command, and it was very easy to understand what New Zealand's crisis response was, in Mumbai, you had to actually put people into the field because the news and the information wasn't coming through in the same way. So I needed 3 teams of staff to go and do a pretty grim job to walk the A&E wards of the 3 Mumbai hotels to literally find our people if they were there. And of course, in that, you have to be by your team to support them. So in the early hours that were unfolding as the injured and the dead were being delivered, we walked those A&E rooms, and it was a pretty difficult and tough environment. And you have to be there for your staff. But on the other side of this, we also needed to create a place where we could gather the British people that were caught out at one or other of these centres of attack. And we had moved out of South Mumbai, our office, into new premises nearer the airport, so we didn't have a physical presence downtown. But the British Council did, and they had a library there. So I made a phone call at about 2:30 in the morning and spoke to the director of the British Council and said, I need you to open up the library because we're going to turn it into our own triage centre for the Brits that we're finding on the streets who are running out of the hotels as a place where we can gather them. And again, that personal relationship with him from doing our normal day-to-day routine was fundamental. He just said to me, how quickly do you want it done? I said, as quickly as possible, 45 minutes if you can manage it, 30 minutes would be brilliant, an hour is your absolute limit. And he, in turn, because he had a good team who trusted him, asked his staff to go to open up the library. I got a team from my own office to come, and by 3:30 that following morning, remember the attacks began unfolding about 6, 7 p.m. the night before, we had created our reception center. And we were then sending teams to the 2 main hotels, to the other venues where we knew there were Brits, gathering them and taking them there. And of course, when you have a room full, I think the first group we'd gathered was about 50 people, some literally off the street, some with minor injuries, all traumatized because of what they had seen and experienced. In that moment, you have to establish trust with them. You've brought them to this place, and they know all around them at these other venues, the terrorists are still running around. So how do you connect with those people to say, we're going to make sure you're safe, and we're going to try and get you home as quickly as we can? And a lot of these people, similarly as it was in Christchurch, they ran out of their hotels, out of the restaurants or cafes that they were in, and you leave your bags, forget the credit cards, and opening the hotel safe to get your passport. So most of them didn't have documentation. But I got a team of my own team that I quickly briefed about the process we would go to get the personal details, and actually to give comfort and to show compassion to people in dire need. And I myself made sure that every half hour or so I walked around, made sure that our Brits, as their numbers swelled, I think we managed to field over that sort of first 12 to 16 hours after the crisis about 160 British people, and a number of New Zealanders and Australians that we also found that we passed on to their missions, a number of Europeans, because that's what we do for friends as well. And getting those people safe and building the trust because of the personal connection I and my staff were making with them, getting them to the airport, getting them the documentation that they needed to get on their way. And for some of the work that we did, it was also connecting with the local organizations that we worked with ordinarily. And on the other side of that equation was the work that we were doing with the local authorities. You know, the time we spend to get to know local ministers, chief of police, in that moment of crisis, being able to pick up the phone and talk directly to the people handling the crisis, to get an inside track was absolutely fundamental. But we also had an offer, which is our particular expertise at GCHQ in the UK, that we would be able to monitor, this is all in the public domain, the mobile conversations between the terrorists and the perpetrators in Pakistan. Because what we needed to be able to give the Indians were the instructions that were being handed out to work out exactly how many terrorists, where they were, which parts of the 2 hotels that they ended up in they were hiding, and what their plans were. So making that connection for the Indian authorities, they had to ask so that we could give them the information, and we needed them to request it so that we could get the proper approvals within the law within which we have to operate in order to get that intelligence. I think had we not made that connection to enable the Indian authorities to know actually the actual numbers and where they were and the instructions that they were being given, and actually the urgency to close them down, the terrorist attack may have lasted for longer than the 3 days that it actually did. It could have been a far worse, an already great tragedy. So, you know, moving quickly, using your personal connections, having the courage, the conviction, and the confidence, that is the power of the personal and the personal relationships that you can use to achieve the results that you need to get. Those are 2 examples of what I have done. As I said, it's all about being locally engaged in order to deliver the global results that we need. Thank you.